Japan's decision to launch the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 was not a sudden impulse, but the inevitable outcome of a century-long quest for security, resources, and status as a great power. To comprehend why a nation with a population of 73 million and limited natural wealth would confront the industrial giant of the United States, we must start at the beginning. The forced opening of Japan to the West and the rapid transformation that turned isolation into ambition. This story of expansion is one of adaptation, resentment, and the relentless drive for self-sufficiency in a world dominated by European empires. The foundation was laid in the mid-19th century. For over 200 years, under the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan had maintained sakoku, a policy of national seclusion that limited foreign contact to a handful of Dutch and Chinese traders at Nagasaki. This isolation preserved internal peace, but left Japan vulnerable to Western encroachment. In July 1853, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Edo Bay with 4 black ships, steam-powered warships armed with Pekshans guns, demanding trade rights. Perry's second visit in 1854 forced the signing of the Treaty of Kanagawa, opening ports at Shimoda and Hakodate. Similar unequal treaties followed with Britain, France, Russia, and the Netherlands, granting extraterritoriality to foreigners and low tariffs that drained Japan's silver reserves. These humiliations ignited the Meiji Restoration. On January 3, 1868, Imperial forces loyal to Emperor Mutsuhito, Meiji, overthrew the shogunate in the Boshin War, restoring direct rule to the throne. The new government abolished feudal domains, created a conscript army based on universal service, and sent missions abroad to study Western models. The Iwakura mission of 1871 to 1873, led by Iwakura Tomomi, toured Europe and America, bringing back blueprints for railroads, telegraphs, and factories. By 1889, Japan had a constitution modeled on Prussia's, a parliament, diet, and a cabinet system. Industrialization accelerated. The first silk reeling factory opened in 1872, and by 1890, Japan produced its own rifles and ships. The military reforms were particularly transformative. The army, trained by French advisors, adopted the Prussian General Staff model. The Navy, built with British expertise, launched its first ironclad in 1881. These forces proved their worth in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. Triggered by disputes over Korea, the conflict saw Japanese armies capture Port Arthur and Weihaiwei, while Admiral Togo Heihachiro's fleet destroyed China's Beiyang Squadron at the Battle of the Yalu River on September 17, 1894. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, signed on April 17, 1895, ceded Taiwan, the Pescadores, and the Liaotung Peninsula to Japan, recognized Korean independence, a Japanese protectorate in all but name, and paid an indemnity of 200 million taels. France, Russia, and Germany intervened to return Liaotung for a price, fueling Japanese resentment and militarism. The Triple Intervention of April 23, 1895, sowed seeds of revanchism. It convinced Tokyo that alliances were necessary to counter great powers. Japan joined Britain in the Anglo-Japanese alliance of January 30, 1902, ending a century of isolation and positioning Japan as Asia's counterweight to Russia. This pact proved timely in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Border clashes in Korea escalated into war on February 8, 1904, when Japanese destroyers launched a surprise torpedo attack on Russia's Port Arthur squadron. The land campaign saw General Nogi Maresuke's Third Army capture Port Arthur after a 6-month siege costing 60,000 Japanese lives. At sea, Admiral Togo's fleet annihilated Russia's Baltic fleet at Tsushima on May 27, 1905, in a battle that lasted less than 2 hours. The Treaty of Portsmouth, mediated by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt on September 5, 1905, granted Japan southern Sakhalin, the Liaotung lease, and railway rights in Manchuria, while recognizing Japanese influence in Korea. Roosevelt earned the Nobel Peace Prize, but the terms, no full indemnity and no annexation of Manchuria, sparked rice riots in Japan on September 5, 1906, killing 30 people and forcing Prince Saionji Kinmochi's cabinet to resign. Korea became a protectorate in 1905 and was annexed in 1910, providing rice and minerals. By 1920, Japan was the world's 8th largest economy, with a population of 56 million, a literacy rate of 90%, and exports of silk, tea, and textiles fueling growth. The Navy ranked 3rd globally, with the battleship Nagato commissioning in 1920, capable of 30 knots and armed with 16-inch guns. The Army expanded to 21 divisions, trained in European tactics and equipped with Arisaka rifles. Prosperity masked vulnerabilities. Japan imported 80% of its oil from the US and Dutch East Indies, 70% of its iron ore from China and Malaya, and 90% of its copper. Coal from Hokkaido and Kyushu met domestic needs, but steel production required imports. The population reached 60 million by 1925, straining food supplies and urban infrastructure. Intellectuals like Shumei Okakura promoted Pan-Asianism, while ultranationalist societies like the Black Dragon advocated a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere for living space. The Taisho era, 1913 to 1926, brought liberal democracy. Japan joined the Allies in the First World War, seizing German Shandong and Pacific Islands. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Japan proposed a racial equality clause for the League Covenant, but it was rejected by the British dominions. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921 to 1922 limited arms. Japan accepted a 5-5-3 ratio in capital ships, US and Britain at 525,000 tons each, Japan at 315,000, preserving regional superiority. The four-power treaty with the US, Britain, France and Japan stabilized the Pacific, while the nine-power treaty reaffirmed China's open door. Cooperation ended with the Great Depression. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 collapsed Japan's silk exports. 40% of its US trade. Prices fell 80%, bankrupting farms and causing riots. Unemployment hit 3 million by 1931, and the yen devalued 50%. Military spending rose to 10% of the budget as the Army and Navy competed for influence. The catalyst was Manchuria. The Kwantung Army, guarding the South Manchuria Railway since 1905, chafed under civilian oversight. On September 18, 1931, the Mukden Incident, an explosion on the railway near Shenyang, orchestrated by Colonel Kanji Ishiwara, triggered invasion. Japanese forces took Mukden the next day and occupied the province by February 1932, installing Puyi as puppet ruler of Manchukuo. The League's Lytton report of October 1932 called it aggression, prompting Japan's withdrawal on March 27, 1933. Manchukuo yielded coal and iron, but tensions with China rose. The Tangu Truce of May 29, 1933, demilitarized Beijing, but clashes persisted. The Marco Polo Bridge incident on July 7, 1937, between Japanese and Chinese troops near Beijing, sparked the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japanese forces took Beijing on July 29 and Shanghai in November, after 3 months of fighting costing 40,000 Japanese lives. Nanjing fell on December 13, 1937, followed by 6 weeks of occupation that resulted in widespread civilian hardship, drawing global outrage. US missionaries and businessmen reported the events, prompting Roosevelt's quarantine speech on October 5, 1937, advocating isolation of aggressors. Japan committed 1 million troops to China by 1938, consuming 400,000 barrels of oil monthly, 80% from the US. The USS Panay sinking on December 12, 1937, by Japanese aircraft killed 3 Americans. Japan paid $2.2 million indemnity on April 13, 1938, but suspicion lingered. The European War in September 1939 offered opportunities. Japan signed the Soviet Non-Aggression Pact on April 13, 1941, freeing the North. France's fall in June 1940 allowed basing in Indochina. The US responded with the Export Control Act on July 2, 1940, limiting scrap metal and aviation fuel. The Tripartite Pact of September 27, 1940, aligned Japan with Germany and Italy, but Roosevelt saw it as provocation. Japan's occupation of southern Indochina in July 1941 prompted Roosevelt's asset freeze and oil embargo on July 26. Britain and the Netherlands joined, cutting 90% of Japan's supply. With 6 to 12 months of reserves, Tokyo chose war. Konoye sought diplomacy, but the Hull Note of November 26 demanded withdrawal from China. He resigned October 16. Tojo took office October 18, approving war on November 5. The Imperial Conference on November 6, with Emperor Hirohito's approval, greenlit the southern advance and Pearl Harbor strike. The Second Sino-Japanese War, ignited by the Marco Polo Bridge incident on July 7, 1937, rapidly expanded from a local border dispute into a grueling campaign that would consume Japan for 8 years and ultimately contribute to its decision to strike Pearl Harbor. What began as a Japanese effort to secure Beijing and northern China quickly engulfed the entire eastern seaboard, turning the conflict into Asia's largest war since the 19th century. By the summer of 1938, Japanese forces had pushed deep into the Chinese interior, capturing key cities and industrial centers, but the cost in lives, resources, and international standing was mounting. The war's early phases highlighted Japan's military prowess, but also exposed the limits of its economy and the growing rift with the West, particularly the United States, which saw the invasion as a threat to regional stability and its own economic interests. The initial offensives were swift and decisive. After the Marco Polo Bridge clash, Japanese troops from the China Garrison Force crossed the Yongding River and entered Beijing on July 29, 1937, with minimal resistance from Chiang Kai-shek's National Revolutionary Army. The city fell without a fight, allowing Japan to declare the restoration of the Manchukuo-style puppet regime under Wang Jingwei. Attention turned to Shanghai, a symbol of Chinese resistance and Western economic presence. On August 13, 1937, Japanese Marines clashed with Chinese defenders in the international settlement, sparking 3 months of brutal urban warfare. The Battle of Shanghai involved over 500,000 troops on both sides, with Japanese naval gunfire and air support pounding Chinese positions. General Iwane Matsui's Shanghai Expeditionary Army committed 300,000 men, facing Chiang's elite German-trained divisions. The fighting cost Japan 40,000 casualties and China 250,000. But Shanghai fell on November 12, 1937, after Japanese Marines raised their flag on the Bund. The advance continued inland. Japanese forces captured Suzhou and Wuxi in November, reaching the Yangtze River by December. Nanjing, the nationalist capital, was surrounded on December 7th. Chiang evacuated the government to Chongqing on December 8th, leaving a rearguard under Tang Shengji. Japanese troops entered the city on December 13, 1937, beginning a 6-week occupation marked by widespread disorder. Reports from foreign journalists and missionaries documented looting, arson, and violence against civilians, with estimates of 200,000 deaths. The International Safety Zone Committee, led by John Raab of Siemens, sheltered 250,000 refugees. The U.S. government protested on December 21, 1937, but Japan denied systematic wrongdoing, attributing incidents to lawless elements. The Nanjing occupation strained Japan's relations with the West. The United States, with $200 million in annual trade with China, condemned the events in a State Department statement on December 19, 1937. American missionaries numbering over 5,000 in China sent detailed accounts to Washington, influencing public opinion. Roosevelt's quarantine speech on October 5, 1937, had already hinted at a tougher stance, calling for collective action against aggressors. Domestic isolationism limited bolder steps. The Neutrality Act of May 1, 1937, prohibited arms sales to belligerents. However, the sinking of the USS Panay gunboat on December 12, 1937, by Japanese aircraft on the Yangtze River, killing 3 Americans and wounding 43, brought the conflict home. The Panay, a river gunboat escorting standard oil tankers, was strafed and bombed, despite flying the American flag. Japan apologized on December 19th and paid $2 million in compensation on April 13th, 1938, but the incident fueled anti-Japanese sentiment. Secretary of State Cordell Hull called it a deliberate act, prompting Congress to pass the gunboat resolution, allowing limited arms sales to China. In Tokyo, the war in China exposed deep vulnerabilities. The Imperial Japanese Army, now deploying 1-2 million men by 1938, required enormous supplies, 400 0.0 barrels of oil monthly, mostly from the US, and 1.5 million tons of steel annually, half imported. The Navy, tasked with protecting convoys, consumed 200,000 Southern tons of fuel oil per month. The Army's Strike North faction, led by generals like Seishiro Itagaki, advocated invading Siberia for resources, citing the Soviet purges as weakness. The Navy's Strike South group, including Yamamoto, favored Southeast Asia's oil and rubber. Prime Minister Konoye attempted balance, negotiating the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy on September 27, 1940, to deter U.S. intervention. The pact, defensive in nature, committed mutual aid if attacked, but allowed Japan independent action in Asia. The European War in September 1939 shifted priorities. With Britain and France engaged in Europe, their Asian colonies, Malaya, Singapore, and Indochina, seemed vulnerable. Japan remained neutral, signing the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact on April 13, 1941, to secure the North. The fall of France in June 1940 enabled negotiations with Vichy for Indochina bases. Japan occupied northern Indochina in September 1940, securing airfields for strikes on China. The US responded with the Export Control Act on July 2, 1940, limiting scrap metal and aviation fuel. Roosevelt's administration, balancing isolationism with support for China, routed aid via the Burma Road and airlifts over the Himalayas. By 1940, American opinion favored aid to Britain, 68%, and China, 75%. Lend-Lease, enacted March 11, 1941, included $500 million for China. Japan's occupation of southern Indochina in July 1941, aimed at staging for the Dutch East Indies, prompted Roosevelt's asset freeze on July 26 and oil embargo. Britain and the Netherlands joined, cutting 90% of Japan's supply. With reserves for 6 to 12 months, Tokyo faced collapse of its China campaign. Konoye pursued diplomacy, proposing a summit with Roosevelt in October 1941, but Hull rejected it, insisting on full withdrawal. The Hull note of November 26 demanded evacuation of China and Indochina, terms seen as capitulation. Konoye resigned October 16. Tojo took office October 18, approving war on November 5. The Imperial Conference on November 6, with Hirohito's approval, endorsed the Southern Advance and Pearl Harbor strike. Yamamoto's plan, Operation Hawaii, had been refined since January 1941. Captain Minoru Genda designed the carrier raid, practicing shallow-water torpedoes at Kagoshima. The task force sailed November 26 from Hitokapu Bay, 6 carriers, Akagi flagship, 2 battleships, Hiei Kirishima, 2 heavy cruisers, Tone Chikuma, 1 light cruiser, Abukuma, 9 destroyers, and submarines. The fleet arrived 230 miles north of Oahu during the night of December 6th to 7th. At 06:00 Hawaii time, the first wave launched 183 aircraft, 40 torpedo bombers, 51 dive bombers, 50 high-level bombers, 43 Zeros. The second wave of 171 followed at 07:15. Radar at Opana Point detected the formation at 07:40, but dismissed it as B-17s. Fuchida crossed the coast at 07:55, fired a flare and radioed, "Tora, Tora, Tora." Torpedo bombers hit Battleship Row at 07:55. Oklahoma capsized after 3 hits, trapping 429. West Virginia sank with 106 dead. California took 2 and settled. Dive bombers struck Arizona at 08:06. A 1/760-pound bomb detonated magazines, killing 177. High-level bombers destroyed 188 aircraft at airfields. The first wave withdrew at 08:10, the second wave at 08:54 focused on ships. By 09:45 the raid ended. US losses 2,403 killed, 1,178 wounded, 8 battleships hit, 4 sunk, 2 refloated, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, 188 aircraft. Japanese losses 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, 64 killed. Kimmel and Short were relieved December 17th. Roosevelt addressed Congress December 8th, a date which will live in infamy. US declared war on Japan, Germany and Italy on the US December 11th. Pearl Harbor unified America. By 1945, US industry produced 300 Ruhr-Zurand aircraft and 88 Ruhr-Zurand tanks. Japan's strike awakened the giant. The oil embargo imposed by the United States on July 26, 1941, following Japan's occupation of southern Indochina, created an immediate crisis for Tokyo's war machine and forced the Japanese government into a corner from which diplomacy seemed the only escape, but one that proved impossible. With stockpiles of petroleum products sufficient for only 6 to 12 months of full military operations, Japan faced the prospect of its army in China grinding to a halt and its navy unable to protect vital supply lines. The embargo was not an isolated act. Britain and the Netherlands quickly followed suit, blocking access to the rubber plantations of Malaya and the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. This coordinated economic blockade left Japan with a narrow window to secure alternative sources or face collapse. Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoye, already navigating a cabinet divided between civilian moderates and military hardliners, saw one last chance in direct talks with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Yet the failure of these negotiations, culminating in the Hull Note of November 26, 1941, sealed the path to war. What followed was a meticulously orchestrated plan to strike Pearl Harbor, designed not to win the war, but to buy the time needed for conquests in Southeast Asia. Konoye's diplomatic efforts began in earnest after the embargo. On August 6, 1941, he proposed a summit meeting with Roosevelt in Alaska, or the Aleutians, offering concessions such as a non-aggression pact with China and withdrawal from Indochina in exchange for lifted sanctions. Roosevelt, advised by Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Ambassador Joseph Grew in Tokyo, was open to dialogue but insisted on preconditions: a verifiable halt to aggression in China. Hull, a lifelong advocate for the open-door policy, viewed Japan's actions as a direct violation of China's sovereignty and American trade interests. Grew, from his post in Tokyo, warned Washington on November 27, 1941, that war was imminent unless concessions were made, but his cables emphasized the military's dominance in Tokyo. Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura, a moderate admiral who had served as foreign minister in 1939, led the talks in Washington alongside Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu, a career diplomat sent by Konoye, on November 14th. Nomura had been appointed in February 1941 with instructions to ease tensions. The two men met with Hull 20 times between April and November, proposing a modus vivendi, a temporary agreement freezing Japanese expansion in exchange for partial lifting of the embargo. Hull rejected these overtures, insisting on full withdrawal from Indochina and a commitment to negotiate with Chiang Kai-shek. On October 22nd, Nomura cabled Tokyo a draft proposal for a mutual non-aggression pact and economic normalization. Konoye approved it on October 23rd, but the military vetoed any concessions on China. The breaking point came with the Hull Note. On November 26, 1941, Hull presented Nomura and Kurusu with a 10-point document demanding Japanese withdrawal from China, Indochina, and Manchuria, recognition of French sovereignty in Indochina, and an end to the tripartite pact's aggressive aspects. To Japanese eyes, this was not a negotiation but an ultimatum, equivalent to a declaration of war. Nomura, stunned, cabled Tokyo. The note is tantamount to an ultimatum. Kurusu, more optimistic, urged acceptance. But Tojo's cabinet, formed on October 18th after Konoye's resignation, saw it as confirmation of American hostility. Tojo, a Manchurian veteran with a reputation for ruthlessness, convened the Supreme War Council on November 28th. The army chief, General Hajime Sugiyama, and Navy Minister Admiral Shigetaro Shimada agreed. War was inevitable. The Imperial Conference on December 1st, 1941, attended by Emperor Hirohito, approved the main points in imperial policy, authorizing the Southern Advance and the Pearl Harbor operation. The Pearl Harbor Plan, codenamed Operation Z, or Operation Hawaii, originated in January 1941 under Admiral Yamamoto. Yamamoto, who had witnessed the limitations of battleship warfare at Tsushima and studied U.S. naval tactics during his time in Washington from 1919 to 1926, doubted Japan's ability to win a prolonged war against America. In a memorandum to Navy Minister Zengo Yoshida on January 7, 1941, he wrote, "Should hostilities once break out between Japan and the U.S., we cannot be certain that we can win. It is certain that we will lose if the war drags on." Yet he proposed a daring preemptive strike on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor to neutralize it for 6 to 12 months, allowing the southern conquests to proceed unhindered. Yamamoto assigned Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka as his chief of staff and Commander Minoru Genda as air tactical officer. Genda, a carrier advocate who had flown Zeros in China, envisioned a carrier-based assault using shallow-water torpedoes, a technique U.S. planners deemed impossible in Pearl Harbor's confined waters. Planning accelerated in spring 1941. The combined fleet conducted secret exercises in Kagoshima Bay in August, simulating the raid with mock battleships. Torpedo bombers practiced drops in shallow water, modifying the Type 91 aerial torpedo with wooden fins to prevent broaching. Dive bombers trained with 16-inch armor-piercing bombs converted for aircraft use weighing 760 pounds each. The Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber and Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bomber were selected for their accuracy, escorted by the agile Mitsubishi A6M0. The plan called for 2 waves, the first with 183 aircraft targeting battleships and airfields, the second with 171 focusing on remaining ships and facilities. The goal was destruction of the battle line, not the carriers assumed in port or repair yards to prevent pursuit of the invasion fleets. Challenges abounded. Pearl Harbor's shallow depth, 40 feet, risked torpedo duds, and the narrow channel limited maneuvering. Genda's solution, low-level drops at 50 feet. Weather was a concern. The fleet would sail in radio silence across 400 miles of open ocean. Yamamoto selected Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, a battleship specialist with limited carrier experience, to lead the task force Kido Butai. Nagumo, cautious by nature, questioned the raid's value, but accepted for its potential to support the southern push. Diplomatic cover-masked preparations. Nomura and Kurusu continued talks in Washington, presenting proposals for a temporary freeze on expansion in exchange for eased sanctions. Hull, committed to the open door, rejected them, insisting on verifiable withdrawal from China. On November 26th, the Hull note arrived, a 10-point document demanding evacuation of all occupied territories, recognition of French Indochina, and abrogation of the Tripartite Pact's aggressive clauses. Nomura cabled Tokyo, "This is tantamount to an ultimatum." Tojo's cabinet interpreted it as such. The Supreme War Council met on November 28th, with Army and Navy agreeing on war. The Imperial Conference on December 1st, 1941, in the presence of Emperor Hirohito, approved the main points in imperial policy. Hirohito, after consultation with Lord Keeper Kido Koichi, gave his assent, marking the final step to war. The Kido Butai assembled in utmost secrecy. On November 26th, Nagumo's fleet departed Hitokapu Bay in the Kurils, steaming east under radio silence. The corps was 6 fleet carriers: Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, embarking 353 aircraft, 40 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, 103 Aichi D-3A dive bombers, 131 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, and 79 B-5N level bombers. Support included 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, 2 heavy cruisers, Tone and Chikuma, 1 light cruiser, Abukuma, 9 destroyers, and 3 fleet submarines for scouting. The fleet averaged 18 knots, zigzagging to avoid detection, arriving 230 miles north of Oahu during the night of December 6th to 7th. Launch began at 06:00 Hawaii time on December 7th. The first wave of 183 aircraft, led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida in a Zero, included 40 torpedo bombers, 51 dive bombers, 50 level bombers, and 43 fighters. The second wave of 171 followed at 07:15. U.S. preparations were inadequate. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel focused on sabotage, not air attack, leaving battleships moored in Pearl Harbor for weekend liberty. General Walter C. Short clustered aircraft on airfields to prevent ground sabotage. Codebreakers had decrypted diplomatic purple code, but not naval JN-25, missing the fleet's approach. Radar at Apana Point detected the first wave at 07:40, 50 miles out, but Lieutenant Kermit Tyler dismissed it, as expected, B-17s. Fuchida crossed the coast at 07:55, fired a flare signaling surprise and radioed, "Tora, Tora, Tora." Torpedo bombers hit Battleship Row at 07:55. Oklahoma took 3 hits and capsized, trapping 429. West Virginia sank with 106 dead. California took 2 and settled. Dive bombers struck Arizona at 08:10. A 760-pound bomb detonated magazines, killing 177. High-level bombers destroyed 188 aircraft at Hickam, Wheeler, and Ford Island. The first wave withdrew at 08:10. The second wave at 08:54 focused on ships. By 09:45, the raid ended. U.S. losses 2403 killed, 178 wounded, 8 battleships damaged, 4 sunk, 2 refloated, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, 188 aircraft. Japanese losses 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, 64 killed. Kimmel and Short were relieved December 17th. Roosevelt addressed Congress December 8th, a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan, 3888 when West House, unanimous Senate. Germany and Italy declared on the U.S. December 11th. Pearl Harbor unified America. By 1945, U.S. industry produced 300 Zu-0 aircraft and 88 Zu-0 tanks. Japan's strike awakened the giant. The raid on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, achieved tactical surprise but failed to alter the strategic balance in the Pacific for long. While the attack damaged or immobilized 8 U.S. battleships, with the USS Arizona exploding in a catastrophic magazine detonation that claimed 177 lives, the USS Oklahoma capsizing after 3 torpedo hits and trapping 429 men inside, the USS West Virginia sinking upright with 106 fatalities, and the USS California settling to the harbor bottom from 2 torpedoes, the 3 key aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet, USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, were absent and undamaged. Enterprise was returning from Wake Island with Marine reinforcements, Lexington was ferrying Marine fighters to Midway, and Saratoga was on the west coast undergoing repairs. The raid destroyed 188 aircraft on the ground and inflicted 403 fatalities, including 68 civilians, but left the submarine base, fuel tanks holding 4 million barrels of oil, and repair yards intact. These oversights meant the U.S. Navy could respond within weeks, turning what Japan hoped would be a knockout blow into the spark that ignited America's full industrial and military mobilization. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's address to a joint session of Congress on December 8, 1941, at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, encapsulated the shift from shock to resolve. Delivered in the House chamber, amid a tense atmosphere of lawmakers and dignitaries, Roosevelt's speech lasted 8 minutes and opened with the now iconic line, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." He detailed the raid's treachery, noting that Japanese diplomats had been negotiating peace even as the fleet steamed toward Hawaii. "No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion," Roosevelt declared, "the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory." The chamber responded with thunderous applause. The House voted 388-1 for war. Reps Jeanette Rankin, a pacifist who had also voted against U.S. entry in the First World War, dissented alone. The Senate approved unanimously moments later. Roosevelt signed the declaration at 4:10 p.m., officially placing the United States at war with Japan. The national response was immediate and transformative. Isolationism, which had dominated American politics since the Senate's rejection of the League of Nations in 1919, evaporated overnight. Gallup polls from December 1941 showed 97% support for the war effort, a figure that held through 1945. Civilian life changed rapidly. Gasoline rationing began in May 1942, and victory gardens sprouted in backyards, producing 40% of the nation's vegetables by 1944. Hollywood shifted to propaganda films like Why We Fight, narrated by Frank Capra, while radio broadcasts from Edward R. Murrow in London rallied public spirit. The Selective Service Act, already in place since 1940, expanded to induct 4 million men by war's end, with women entering factories through the War Manpower Commission. Militarily, the U.S. Army Air Forces grounded all civilian flights on December 8th and began converting commercial airliners for transport. The War Production Board, established January 16, 1942 under Donald Nelson, coordinated the shift to a war economy. Automobile manufacturers like Ford and General Motors halted car production in February 1942, retooling for aircraft and tanks. Ford's Willow Run plant near Detroit, operational by May 1942, aimed to assemble one B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every hour, achieving 300 per month by 1943. Shipyards on the West Coast, including those in San Francisco and Bremerton, launched Liberty ships at a rate of 3 per day by mid-1942, each capable of carrying 10 Sino-Japanese tons of cargo. The Two-Ocean Navy Act of July 1940 authorized 300 warships, including 18 fleet carriers by 1945. In the Pacific, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz assumed command of the Pacific Fleet on December 31, 1941, succeeding Admiral Husband E. Kimmel. Nimitz, a submariner with experience in fleet operations, prioritized aircraft carriers over battleships, recognizing the raid's lesson in air power. The fleet's surviving strength, 6 heavy cruisers, 16 destroyers, and 70 submarines, focused on reconnaissance and interdiction. Submarines like USS Argonaut began patrolling Japanese waters in January 1942, sinking 20 merchant ships by March. The first American retaliation came on April 18, 1942. The Doolittle Raid. 16 B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, launched from USS Hornet 650 miles east of Japan, struck Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. Led by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, the planes dropped 500-pound bombs on industrial targets and dropped propaganda leaflets. The raid caused limited damage, 50 civilians killed, 400 buildings hit, but achieved immense psychological value. It forced Japan to bolster home defenses, diverting 500 aircraft and 150 Zulu-0 troops. All crews reached China, though 8 were captured and 3 executed after a show trial. Doolittle received the Medal of Honor, and the raid boosted U.S. morale, proving Japan was not invulnerable. Japan's southern conquests proceeded apace in early 1942. On December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, Japanese troops landed on Luzon in the Philippines, overwhelming U.S. and Filipino forces. General Douglas MacArthur's Far East Command fell back to the Bataan Peninsula, where 75 Iwo Jima defenders held against superior numbers until April 1942. The fall of Bataan on April 9th led to the infamous march, where 76 Ziozaran prisoners endured a 65-mile trek under harsh conditions, with 10 Saozausen dying from disease, starvation, and mistreatment. Corregidor surrendered on May 6th. MacArthur, evacuated by PT boat to Australia on March 11th, vowed, "I shall return." The Philippines campaign cost Japan 10 Ziozaran casualties, but secured strategic bases for the defense of the East Indies. In Malaya, Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita's 25th Army landed on December 8, 1941, and advanced 400 miles in 70 days, capturing Singapore on February 15, 1942. The Gibraltar of the East fell to 35-0 Japanese against 85-0 British, Indian and Australian defenders, a stunning defeat attributed to poor British preparation. The Dutch East Indies fell in 3 months, Tarakan on January 11th, Balikpapan on January 24th, and Java on March 9th. These victories yielded 7 million barrels of oil annually, 80% of Japan's needs, plus rubber and tin. Yet success bred overextension. Japanese merchant shipping losses reached 100 vessels in the first 6 months of 1942 to U.S. submarines, which, after initial torpedo failures, began sinking 55% of Japan's fleet by war's end. The army in China, facing guerrilla warfare from Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists, tied down 2 million troops with little territorial gain. The Navy, focused on conquest, neglected convoy protection, allowing U.S. submarines to interdict supplies. The first naval setback came at the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 7th to 8th, 1942. Yamamoto's plan for Operation MO aimed to isolate Australia by capturing Port Moresby in New Guinea. The Port Moresby attack force, including light carrier Shoho and heavy cruisers, clashed with U.S. carriers Yorktown and Lexington under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. U.S. dive bombers sank Shoho on May 7th, while heavy cruiser damage to Shokaku forced her withdrawal. Lexington was lost to internal explosions, but the battle marked the first carrier engagement and prevented the invasion, saving Australia from further threat. Midway on June 4th to 7th, 1942, was the decisive reversal. U.S. codebreakers at Station Hypo, led by Captain Joseph Rochefort, decrypted JN-25, identifying Midway as the target. Nimitz positioned Enterprise, Hornet and Yorktown in ambush. Nagumo's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, launched against the island at 06:00. U.S. torpedo bombers diverted fighters, allowing dive bombers to strike at 10:22, sinking Akagi, Kaga and Soryu. Hiryu damaged Yorktown but was sunk at 17:00. 4 Japanese carriers lost, 248 aircraft destroyed, 357 sailors killed. U.S. losses: Yorktown, destroyer Hammond, 150 aircraft, 307 killed. Yamamoto withdrew from Yamato, reporting, "We have been defeated in a carrier battle." The loss of 110 veteran pilots was irreplaceable. Japan trained 100 monthly, the US 10-00. Midway ended Japan's offensive initiative. The Guadalcanal campaign, launched August 7, 1942, tested Japanese resolve. Marines seized the island's airfield, prompting a naval race. Battles at Savo Island, August 8th to 9th, Japanese victory but heavy losses. Eastern Solomons, August 23rd to 24th, U.S. sank Ryujo. And Santa Cruz, October 25th to 26th, Japan sank Hornet but lost 100 aircraft, strained resources. By February 1943, Japan evacuated, its first major land defeat. In the Philippines, Batan's fall on April 9th led to the March, where 76 Aozozern prisoners endured 65 miles of hardship, with 10 Haozomaru fatalities from disease and exhaustion. Corregidor surrendered May 6th. MacArthur's "I shall return" became a rallying cry. Germany's declaration on December 11th enabled U-boats to target U.S. shipping, sinking 609 vessels, 1 million tons, in the second happy time, January to July 1942. Liberty ships launched at 3 per day outpaced losses. The Battle of the Atlantic shifted in May 1943's Black May, with Allies sinking 41 U-boats using escort carriers, radar and code-breaking. Operation Torch on November 8, 1942, landed 107 U.S. troops in North Africa, opening the Mediterranean front. Japan's strategy faltered. The Bismarck Sea Battle on March 2 to 4, 1943, saw Allied aircraft sink 8 transports and 4 destroyers to New Guinea, with 500 Japanese fatalities. U.S. submarines, with improved torpedoes by mid-1943, sank 55% of Japan's merchant fleet. By late 1943, U.S. production reached 96,000 aircraft annually, Japan's 28,000. The Marianas Campaign in June 1944's Great Marianas Turkey Shoot destroyed 645 Japanese aircraft for 123 U.S. losses. The war concluded with atomic bombs on Hiroshima, August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki, August 9th, prompting surrender on August 15th. Pearl Harbor's legacy, America's rise as a superpower, forged in unity and production. The raid on Pearl Harbor, executed with tactical precision on December 7, 1941, provided Japan with the breathing room it needed to consolidate its southern conquests in the first half of 1942, but the strategic calculus shifted dramatically by mid-year. What Yamamoto had predicted as a 6-month window of opportunity shrank to mere months as American industrial might, innovative tactics, and intelligence breakthroughs began to reverse the gains. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 marked the inflection point, where the loss of 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of experienced pilots exposed Japan's irreplaceable human capital deficit. From there, the Pacific War became a grinding campaign of attrition that Japan, with its limited resources and overextended supply lines, could not sustain. By 1945, the combined pressure of island-hopping offensives, submarine interdiction, and strategic bombing had reduced Japan's economy to rubble, leading to the unprecedented use of atomic weapons and unconditional surrender. Pearl Harbor's legacy endures not as a Japanese triumph, but as the event that forged America's emergence as a global superpower and reshaped Asia's post-war order. The early successes of 1942 masked underlying weaknesses in Japan's position. The conquest of the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies secured vital resources. Malaya's rubber plantations produced 700,000 metric tons annually, enough for 40,000 aircraft tires, while Indonesian oil fields yielded 7 million barrels per year, covering 80% of Japan's needs. Thailand and Burma provided rice and tungsten, yet these gains came at a high cost. Japanese merchant shipping, totaling 6 million tons in December 1941, lost 1.2 million tons in 1942 to U.S. submarines, which, after resolving early torpedo defects, began a campaign of unrestricted warfare. The army in China, facing a dual front against nationalist and communist forces, consumed 500 Duozhuan troops and vast supplies with little territorial progress. The Navy, victorious at sea, diverted carriers to defensive roles, stretching its 10 fleet carriers thin across 4,000 miles of ocean. Midway exposed these strains. The U.S. victory was as much intelligence triumph as naval engagement. Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, under Captain Joseph Rochefort, had broken JN-25 in May 1942, confirming Midway as the target through a ruse, a cable from Hawaii to Midway reporting water shortages, intercepted and decrypted as urgent. Nimitz positioned Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown 200 miles northeast of the atoll. Nagumo's force, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, arrived on June 4th, launching 108 aircraft against Midway at 2:04:30. U.S. Marine defenders on the island fought back with F-4F Wildcats, downing 13 attackers. At 10:22, U.S. dive bombers from Enterprise struck, igniting Akagi's deck with fueled aircraft. Kaga and Soryu followed in minutes, their hangars ablaze from delayed fuse bombs. Hiryu launched a counterstrike, damaging Yorktown with torpedoes and bombs. U.S. aircraft from Enterprise sank Hiryu at 17:00. 4 Japanese carriers lost, 248 aircraft destroyed, 3,057 sailors killed. U.S. losses: Yorktown, sunk June 7th by submarine I-168. Destroyer Hamon, 150 aircraft, 307 killed. Yamamoto withdrew from Yamato on June 5th, his report to Tokyo admitting, "We have suffered a severe defeat in carrier aviation." The loss of 110 veteran pilots, 25% of Japan's carrier air groups, was irreplaceable. Training took 18 months, while the U.S. produced 10 Azusarin aviators monthly by 1943. Midway halted Japan's offensive. No major carrier raids followed. The Guadalcanal campaign, beginning August 7, 1942, tested Japanese endurance. U.S. Marines of the 1st Division landed on the island, seizing Lunga Airfield, renamed Henderson Field. The Cactus Air Force of Marine and Army pilots flew from the Strip, contesting air superiority. Naval battles ensued. Savo Island on August 8th to 9th saw Japanese cruisers sink 4 Allied ships, but at heavy cost. Eastern Solomons on August 23rd to 24th sank light carrier Ryujo. Santa Cruz on October 25th to 26th cost Japan 100 aircraft, but sank Hornet. Iron Bottom Sound became a graveyard of ships. Guadalcanal lasted 6 months, costing Japan 31,000 lives and 800 aircraft. U.S. submarines sank 100,000 tons of shipping bound for the island. By February 7, 1943, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake ordered evacuation, the first Japanese retreat in the war. The Philippines campaign paralleled this attrition. Batan's fall on April 9, 1942, led to the march of 76,000 prisoners over 65 miles, with 10,000 fatalities from hardship. Corregidor surrendered May 6. MacArthur's return came in October 1944 at Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, where U.S. forces sank 4 Japanese carriers and 3 battleships. U.S. industrial mobilization overwhelmed Japan. The War Production Board coordinated output, 96 Zero aircraft in 1944 alone versus Japan's 28 Io-00. Liberty ships launched at 3 per day, replacing losses faster than Japan could sink them. Submarines with Mark 14 torpedoes fixed by October 1943 sank 55% of Japan's merchant fleet, 3 million tons by war's end. The island-hopping strategy, devised by Admiral Ernest King and Nimitz, bypassed strongholds. Tarawa, in November 1943, cost 1,000 U.S. lives, but secured a base for raids on Truk. Saipan, in June 1944, enabled B-29 strikes on Japan. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot destroyed 645 Japanese aircraft for 123 U.S. losses. Strategic bombing from the Marianas devastated Japan's cities. Operation Meeting House on March 9th to 10th, 1945, firebombed Tokyo, killing 100 Romanzeres and destroying 16 square miles. By August, 67 cities lay in ruins. The atomic bombs, Little Boy on Hiroshima August 6th, Fat Man on Nagasaki August 9th, killed 140 Außensehrend and 70 Außensehrend respectively. Hirohito announced surrender August 15, 1945. Pearl Harbor's legacy, U.S. as superpower, Japan's pacifist constitution and the Cold War's bipolar world.